Interstellar diplomacy operated on three fundamental principles: maintain neutrality, respect cultural boundaries, and never, under any circumstances, let the ambassador's offspring disrupt a trade negotiation worth 17 trillion credits. Station Kepler 442b had managed the first two brilliantly for 3 decades. The third principle, however, was currently being shredded by 4 small, furry creatures who had decided that sleep was optional and screaming was mandatory. According to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Ambassador Thexlar of Vraxis Prime stood in the observation dome, his crystalline exoskeleton refracting the light of distant nebulae in patterns that typically convey diplomatic serenity. Right now, those patterns looked more like a malfunctioning distress beacon. His offspring, the Cubs as the station personnel had taken to calling them, were in their 4th consecutive rotation cycle without proper rest. 4 cycles translated to roughly 72 Earth hours, which meant 72 hours of high-pitched wailing that penetrated bulkheads designed to withstand micrometeorite impacts. Station Commander Velroth, a Tandorian with 6 arms and what used to be infinite patience, had burned through arm number 5's worth of tolerance. Her people had evolved from hive creatures who valued silence above nearly everything except efficiency. The Cubs were providing neither. Perhaps, she suggested with the kind of calm that came from internal screaming, we could relocate the Vraxian delegation to the Outer Rim modules. The Outer Rim is currently hosting the Zephyrite Mineral Consortium, Thexlar replied, his translator adding a mechanical wheeze to approximate his exhaustion. They communicate through subsonic vibrations. My Cubs would interpret that as a challenge and respond with increased volume. From somewhere in the residential sector, right on cue, came a sound that could only be described as a fusion between a dying quantum computer and a territorial bird defending its nest. It was, objectively speaking, impressive that such small creatures could generate that much acoustic energy. It was also, objectively speaking, a diplomatic nightmare. The Vraxian Cubs had arrived 6 cycles ago with their father, who had assured everyone that they were well-behaved, properly socialized, and ready for station life. What Thexlar had failed to mention, or perhaps simply failed to predict, was that Vraxian youth required specific environmental conditions to maintain their sleep patterns. Conditions that included the precise electromagnetic frequency of their homeworld's magnetic field, the gravitational rhythm of 3 moons in synchronized orbit, and the ambient temperature variations that came from a binary star system. Station Kepler 442b, for all its technological marvels, orbited a single yellow dwarf. Its magnetic field was generated by entirely artificial means. It had 0 moons. The first night had been manageable. The Cubs had fussed a bit, made some noise, then eventually exhausted themselves into unconsciousness. The second night, they had learned that exhaustion was reversible, but their sleep deprivation was cumulative. By the third night, they had entered a state that the medical staff described as hyper-alertness, and everyone else described as the apocalypse with fur. Dr. Shendi, the station's chief medical officer and a being composed primarily of bioluminescent gel in a containment suit, had tried every pharmaceutical intervention in the database. Sedatives bounced off the Cubs' metabolism like photons off a black hole's event horizon. Neural dampeners made them glow faintly blue but did nothing for the screaming. One experimental treatment had actually made them scream in harmony, which was somehow worse. The trade summit begins in 2 cycles, Thexlar said quietly, watching through the dome as a cargo vessel departed with what he suspected was unnecessary haste. If my Cubs are not rested and calm by then, the Vraxian Senate will withdraw from the Kepler Accords. They will interpret this as evidence that the station cannot provide basic environmental security. Velroth's primary arms twitched, a gesture that meant she was recalculating options at high speed. The Kepler Accords represented 40 years of negotiation between 17 species. They covered everything from trade routes to military non-aggression pacts. They were, in the opinion of every political analyst in 3 sectors, the only reason this region of space hadn't evolved into economic warfare. And they were about to collapse because 4 cubs refused to sleep. "We have exhausted every protocol," Velroth admitted, which physically pained her to say. "Gravitational adjustment, atmospheric recalibration, even importing soil from Vraxis Prime to create familiar scent markers. The acoustics team has tried white noise, brown noise, and something called pink noise that I'm told exists on a spectrum I cannot perceive. Nothing works." Another wail echoed through the station, this one with a warbling quality that suggested the cubs had discovered they could harmonize in shifts, creating a perpetual cycle of noise. "There is," Thexelar said slowly, his crystalline structure dimming with what looked like resignation, "one remaining option, though it shames me to admit we must resort to it." Velroth leaned forward, all 6 arms folded in an expression of desperate attention. "We could request assistance from the humans." The silence that followed was the first peaceful moment the station had experienced in 4 cycles. Then Velroth's translator made a sound that approximated a laugh, though her species did not technically possess the biological capacity for humor. "The humans? The species that still uses chemical propulsion for atmospheric flight? The ones who just achieved faster-than-light travel within the last century and think it makes them cosmopolitan? Those humans," Thexler confirmed, "have successfully raised offspring in environments ranging from Arctic ice sheets to desert wastelands to the vacuum of space, all with technology that we would classify as aggressively primitive. They have adapted to more hostile conditions than any other spacefaring species, and their children apparently thrive despite living in what amounts to controlled chaos." Velroth considered this. Humanity's application to join the galactic community had been approved mostly because they were persistent to the point of being annoying, and it was easier to let them in than to keep explaining why they should wait another few centuries. They had one representative on the station, some sort of cultural liaison whose job was to explain human oddities to bemused aliens and vice versa. "You want to trust your offspring to a species that invented something called extreme ironing and considers it a legitimate sport?" "I want," Thexler said heavily, "my cubs to sleep. At this point, I would trust them to a sentient fungus if it could accomplish that goal." Another shriek rattled the observation dome's reinforced glass. Somewhere in the residential sector, something expensive-sounding shattered. "Fine," Velroth said, her arms moving in a pattern that conveyed ultimate surrender to absurdity. "Contact the human. Tell her we have a situation that requires her particular expertise in surviving the unsurvivable." As she sent the communication, Velroth reflected that her career had included negotiating with 3 different warrior species, mediating a territorial dispute that involved beings existing in 7 dimensions, and once preventing a war that started because of a translation error involving the word for peace and the word for delicious snack. Yet somehow, 4 small Vraxian cubs had become her greatest challenge. The human's response came back within minutes. "On my way. Bring the cubs to the garden habitat. And Commander, tell your medical team to stand down. This isn't a problem you can solve with science." Velroth stared at the message, her translator struggling to convey her mixture of hope and profound skepticism. Not solve with science? What else was there? She was about to find out that humans, those bizarre little primates from a planet they had somehow not managed to destroy despite their best efforts, had solutions that predated science by several thousand years. Solutions that involved doing something the galactic community had forgotten existed. Being fundamentally, inexplicably, and annoyingly irrational in exactly the right way. The garden habitat occupied the central ring of Station Kepler 442b, a massive biodome that housed plant life from 43 different worlds in carefully segregated atmospheric zones. It was beautiful in the way that only excessive engineering could achieve, perfect, controlled, and entirely artificial. Right now, it also contained 4 screaming cubs who were treating the zephyrite mineral samples like percussion instruments, Dr. Gendi had established what could generously be called a research station and more accurately be described as a last stand. Medical scanners hummed, analyzing everything from the cubs' neural patterns to the molecular composition of their fur. A team of xenobiologists from 6 different species huddled around displays showing data that uniformly indicated one thing. The cubs were perfectly healthy and absolutely miserable. Melatonin levels within normal parameters, reported a Corthian scientist whose 3 eyes blinked in independent, frustrated rhythms. Circadian disruption is present, but not severe enough to explain this level of sleep resistance. By all biological metrics, they should be unconscious. Should be and are represent a gap that is currently destroying my career, Velroth muttered, watching as one cub discovered it could amplify its screams by positioning itself inside a decorative fountain. The acoustic effect was remarkable. The diplomatic effect was catastrophic. Thexelar sat on a bench designed for beings with entirely different skeletal structures, looking as close to defeated as his species' physiology allowed. His crystalline exterior had dulled to a matte gray that his people associated with deep shame. Around him, various diplomatic staff from the upcoming summit were beginning to arrive, and all of them were noticing the chaos. A Selkarian envoy, resembling something between a mantis and a politician, approached with movements that suggested careful neutrality. Ambassador Thexelar, perhaps we should discuss rescheduling the Economic Consortium meeting until your domestic situation is more stable. It was politely phrased. It was also a disaster. Rescheduling meant admitting the Vraxian delegation could not manage basic child care. It meant weakness, which in galactic politics was synonymous with renegotiating every trade agreement from a position of reduced leverage. That will not be necessary, Thexelar said, his translator adding harmonics that implied absolute confidence his biology could not currently support. We have engaged specialist assistance. The Selkarian's compound eyes swiveled to observe a cub attempting to climb the artificial gravity generator while emitting sounds that registered on the seismic sensors. I see. What kind of specialist, exactly? Before Thexelar could answer, the garden's main entrance dilated open, and the human arrived. She was, by galactic standards, aggressively average, medium height for her species, bipedal in that inefficient way humans insisted upon, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that most species associated with prey animals. She wore simple clothing that served function over form, and she carried nothing that resembled scientific equipment. In fact, she carried nothing at all except a small container of what scanners identified as dihydrogen monoxide with trace organic compounds. Water. She had brought water to a medical emergency. Velroth felt her confidence, which had been hovering somewhere near operational minimum, plummet into the negative range. The human walked past the assembled scientists, nodded to Thexelar with a casualness that bordered on inappropriate given the diplomatic stakes, and headed straight for the cubs. They immediately focused on her with the kind of attention that predators reserved for potential threats. The largest cub, whom the staff had nicknamed Decibel Supreme, stopped mid-shriek to stare at this newcomer. "Right then," the human said, her voice carrying an accent that the translators struggled to place, but that somehow conveyed competence anyway. "Let's have a look at you lot." Dr. Gendi's bioluminescent form flickered with concern. "Please be careful. They have been known to bite when approached by unfamiliar species. The medical protocols require a 14-point safety checklist before direct contact." The human glanced at the doctor, smiled in that peculiar way humans did that showed their bone-crushing teeth, and said, "I've raised twins through teething. I think I'll manage." She knelt down, which put her at eye level with the cubs, and did absolutely nothing that appeared in any xenopediatric manual. She did not scan them. She did not adjust atmospheric conditions. She did not administer any pharmaceutical interventions. She just looked at them, tilted her head in observation, and made a small humming sound that had no apparent communicative purpose. The cubs, for the first time in 4 cycles, went quiet. "Fascinating," breathed a Mentorian cognitive specialist, tentacles quivering with scientific excitement. She has triggered a cessation response through what, exactly? There is no detectable change in environmental conditions. The human reached out slowly, letting the cubs observe her hand. They are not sick, she said conversationally, as though diagnosing the problem was as simple as looking. They are scared and overwhelmed, and they do not know why. Everything is wrong, and they are too young to understand what wrong means, so they scream about it. We have established optimal conditions for Vraxian youth, Shendi protested, gesturing at the readouts showing perfectly calibrated temperature, humidity, atmospheric composition. Every parameter matches their biological requirements. You have matched their biology, the human agreed, now close enough that the largest cub could sniff her hand with a nose that resembled a small trunk. But you have not matched their comfort. There is a difference. Velroth's arms folded into a configuration that meant she was trying very hard to understand what was being implied. Comfort is not a measurable variable. How does one calibrate for subjective emotional states? The human looked up at the commander, and her expression suggested she was trying to explain orbital mechanics to someone who believed the universe was flat. You cannot calibrate it. You provide it. That is what they are. But missing. That is why they scream. She turned back to the cubs, who had now surrounded her in a cautious circle. The smallest one, dubbed Soprano Nightmare by the exhausted night shift, tentatively touched the human's arm with one tiny paw. The human did not flinch, did not activate any protective equipment. Just let the cub investigate. Your equipment can tell you everything about their bodies, she continued, voice steady and calm in a way that seemed to affect the cubs directly. But it cannot tell you what they feel. They feel wrong. They feel like their world has ended and nobody is fixing it. So they scream, because that is all they can do. Thexlar stood up, his crystalline structure brightening slightly. Can you fix it? Can you make them feel right? The human smiled again. Smaller this time, less teeth. I can try, but you have to accept that the solution will not make sense to you. It will not appear in any medical database. It will seem primitive and inefficient and completely irrational. At this point, Velroth said with profound sincerity, I would accept a solution that involved ritual dancing if it worked. Close enough, the human replied. Now, everyone needs to back up about 10 meters. You are all very impressive and very qualified, but right now you are also very much in the way. The assembled scientists exchanged glances that ranged from offended to curious. The Korthian researcher adjusted all three eyes to focus on the human. You are dismissing decades of accumulated xenobiological expertise. No, the human said patiently. I am asking you to consider that some problems are older than expertise. Now please, back up. You are radiating anxiety and the cubs can sense it. It was absurd. It was unscientific. It was delivered with such casual confidence that everyone, including Velroth, found themselves retreating to the requested distance. The human sat down properly now, cross-legged on the garden's soft moss floor. She opened her container and took a slow drink of water, movements deliberate and unhurried. The cubs watched her with the kind of attention that beings usually reserved for existential threats or particularly interesting food. Now, she said, voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, let me tell you about the stars. The stars? Gendi's translator crackled with confusion. They are aware of stellar phenomena. Vraxians have achieved spaceflight for 3 centuries. Not those stars, the human replied, still focused on the cubs, who were now sitting down as well, mimicking her posture with the unconscious imitation that young creatures displayed across species. The stars that matter. The ones you see, not the ones you study. She looked up at the biodome's transparent ceiling, where the station's position provided a spectacular view of the nebula cluster beyond. The cubs followed her gaze, their exhausted eyes reflecting distant light. Every human child, the human began, grows up, looking at stars. We do not understand them at first. We do not know about fusion reactions or gravitational dynamics. We just see lights in the dark, and we wonder. And someone, usually someone who loves us, tells us we are safe under those lights. That we are small, but we matter. That the universe is big, but we belong in it. The Mentorian cognitive specialist's tentacles had gone completely still. This is a cultural practice? A learned ritual of reassurance? This, the human said gently, is what you do when science is not enough. One of the cubs, the medium-sized one that security had nicknamed the Warbler, made a small sound. Not a scream, not a shriek. Just a quiet, questioning chirp. The human smiled and began to do something that would baffle the galactic scientific community for the next 3 cycles. She began to sing. The sound that emerged from the human was neither speech nor distress signal. It had melody without apparent mathematical precision, rhythm that defied standard temporal measurement, and emotional content that bypassed every logical filter the universal translators possessed. The devices gave up trying to process it and simply let it through as raw audio. It was, for lack of a better term the assembled scientists could identify, beautiful. The cubs froze, not the frozen of fear or confusion, but the stillness of absolute attention. Their large eyes, which had been radiating exhaustion and distress for 4 cycles straight, fixed on the human with something that resembled wonder. Dr. Gendi's instruments went wild, scanners attempting to analyze what was happening. Neural activity is shifting, stress hormones decreasing, but there is no identifiable mechanism for this change. The sound waves are within normal auditory range, nothing special about the frequency patterns. "Be quiet," Velroth hissed, all 6 arms held rigid. "Whatever is happening, do not interrupt it." The human continued, her voice rising and falling in patterns that seemed arbitrary, yet somehow inevitable. She sang about stars, about sleep, about safety and darkness. The words were simple, almost childish in their construction, yet they carried weight that transcended linguistic meaning. The largest cub moved closer, then closer still, until it was leaning against the human side. The others followed, drawn by instinct older than spaceflight, older than civilization. They arranged themselves around her like planets around a sun, their small bodies finally relaxing from the rigid tension that had defined them for days. The human shifted without stopping her song, adjusting so the cubs could settle more comfortably. She stroked the nearest one's fur with slow, gentle movements that matched her vocal rhythm. The cub's eyes began to close. "Impossible," whispered the Corthian scientist. "Sleep on set this rapid would require pharmaceutical intervention. She has done nothing except make organized noise." But the cubs did not care about impossibility. The second cub yawned, displaying rows of tiny teeth, then tucked its head against its sibling. The third was already breathing in the deep, steady pattern of genuine rest. The human's voice grew softer, the melody winding down like a ship entering standby mode. By the time she reached the final notes, all 4 cubs were asleep, their bodies rising and falling in synchronized breathing that every scanner confirmed was real, natural slumber. Silence filled the garden habitat. Not the terrible silence of anticipation before another scream, but the peaceful quiet of a problem solved in a way nobody had predicted. The human carefully extracted herself from the pile of sleeping cubs, moving with a slowness that suggested practice. She stood, stretched her back with a motion that looked inefficient but was apparently necessary for human spines, and turned to face an audience of stunned xenobiologists. "They will sleep for approximately 6 to 8 hours," she said conversationally. "When they wake, do it again. After 3 or 4 repetitions, they will adjust to the station's rhythm." Thexelar approached, his crystalline structure now glowing with something resembling awe mixed with profound confusion. "What did you do? What was that sound?" The human smiled. "That was a lullaby. something humans have used for thousands of years before we understood why it worked. And why does it work? Demanded the Mentorian specialist. The human shrugged, a gesture that meant far more to humans than translators could convey. Because sometimes, she said, being told you are safe matters more than actually being safe. Because comfort is irrational, and children need irrational things. She looked at the sleeping cubs, then back at the assembled scientists who had spent days trying to solve a problem with logic. You tried to fix their environment, she continued. I just convinced them they were home. The trade summit proceeded without incident. The Kepler Accords survived. Ambassador Thexelar maintained his position, and his cubs slept through the negotiations like civilized beings instead of ambulatory chaos generators. Everyone agreed it was a diplomatic triumph, even if nobody could explain exactly what had happened. The scientific community, however, refused to let mystery stand unchallenged. Within 2 cycles, 17 research teams had submitted proposals to study human lullabies. The Mentorian Cognitive Institute requested samples of 300 different human songs for analysis. A Tandorian university offered funding for a comprehensive study of pre-technological childcare practices across multiple species. The Corthian Academy of Sciences built an entire laboratory dedicated to measuring emotional resonance in acoustic patterns. They all failed spectacularly. The problem, as the human patiently explained to increasingly frustrated researchers, was that lullabies were not technology. They could not be reverse engineered, systematized, or optimized. A computer could replicate the exact frequency patterns, but the cubs would not sleep. An artificial intelligence could generate mathematically perfect melodies, but they carried no weight. Even other species attempting to sing produced results that ranged from ineffective to actively disturbing. It requires something you cannot measure, the human told a symposium of 200 xenopsychologists who had gathered specifically to understand this phenomenon. It requires the singer to mean it, to genuinely wish for the child to feel safe. Your machines can fake the sound, but they cannot fake caring. The academic response was predictable outrage. How dare she suggest that emotion was a viable variable in what should be a purely biological process? How dare she imply that thousands of years of scientific advancement could be superseded by feelings? But the cubs continued to sleep only when the human sang. And slowly, grudgingly, other species began requesting human consultants for childcare situations their technology could not solve. Stations started hiring humans not for their expertise or their advancement, but for their willingness to sit with frightened young beings and convince them the universe was not so terrible after all. Velroth, watching from her office as the human performed the evening lullaby routine that had become station tradition, reflected on the situation with the kind of irony only career diplomats truly appreciated. The galaxy had mastered faster-than-light travel, manipulated gravitational forces, and created artificial consciousness. They had conquered physics itself, but they had forgotten how to comfort a scared child in the dark. It took the humans, those bizarre primates who still believed in irrational things like hope and kindness, to remind everyone that some solutions existed outside logic, that sometimes the most advanced answer was the oldest one, that sometimes you just needed someone to sing. 3 months later, Station Kepler 402b hosted its first official human cultural exchange program. The waiting list included 47 species, all requesting instruction in what the academic papers formally termed pre-technological emotional regulation techniques, and what everyone else called that thing humans do that actually works. The galaxy had spent millennia perfecting rational solutions to every conceivable problem. They had built civilizations on logic, expanded across stars through mathematics, and created wonders through pure reason. And yet, when darkness came and fear crept in, when the young ones cried and science offered no answers, they called for humans, those wonderfully irrational creatures who still believed that sometimes the best response to an impossible problem was simply to care enough to try. The universe remained vast, cold, and fundamentally indifferent. But somewhere on a station orbiting a yellow dwarf, beneath artificial stars and filtered atmosphere, human voice sang softly into the dark. And 4 small cubs, finally understanding they were safe, slept peacefully through the night. Science could explain many things, but it took